So a few months back, I started getting serious with my memorization, and there's a few things that I've learned since then that I'll just hand off to you. If you're like me, you've probably felt this battle where you get easily distracted with things, you just delay or procrastinate your memorization, and before you know it, the day may have ended and you didn't even memorize or revise anything. SubhanAllah, on other days, you're just completely locked in, focused, and you end up memorizing very quickly and smoothly. So before we actually get into some of the actionable tips that I learned, I would say that some of the behavior tips that I've learned is definitely put yourself in the right environment. So this is why I would for sure recommend you joining groups where people are trying to memorize, where people are literally traveling to, wherever, Egypt or all these countries to seek knowledge and stuff like that, because it really motivates you when you see that stuff to, man, I got to push harder, I got to stop being like lazy and doing all this stuff. At least that's what it did for me. And another thing that's really important is to remind yourself while you're actually doing this, and it's not just like a one-time thing, right? This is something you got to really remind yourself that even if you missed a day or didn't memorize that good today, this is meant to be a lifelong habit, because even if you, inshallah, complete this memorization, you don't want to forget it. So you're always going to need to be reviewing. You're always going to need to be doing this daily anyway. So as long as you just see it as a lifelong habit instead of just like a one-time thing, it'll really remove, I think, a lot of the stress people have towards finishing. It's weird because it's never been harder and easier to memorize the Quran. If you think about like the distractions a lot of people have, especially if you're someone who grew up with technology and stuff and with your phone, and you grew up in that generation, it's really easy to be distracted. But at the same time, it's also never been easier in the sense to memorize the fact that you can always listen to the Quran. There's tons of new like kind of gadgets and apps to make the Quran memorization process funner, easier, all these things. But again, there's also tons of addictions. And one of the biggest motivators is like, do you really want to go to the end of your life just thinking, man, I lived in one of the easiest times to ever memorize, but I wasn't able to do it? That's the thing that really keeps me going, is like, I just feel it would probably be like a huge regret thinking like, man, you arrived at the end of your life and you weren't able to memorize, not because of maybe your life circumstances, but it was just because yourself, you didn't have the discipline to do it. Like, all the resources are available. It's really just comes down to you versus you, And if you just remind yourself of that, it'll always like kind of just be like a behavior trigger. It definitely puts like kind of urgency, like, man, I gotta get right, I gotta lock in. But yeah, try it out. Apart from just the behavioral stuff, there's also some ways of memorizing that can be much stronger and much more efficient than we may be doing right now. And this is something I had to kind of learn the hard way, especially in the beginning. So here they are. As for the actionable steps, one of the first things I would recommend is to make sure you're using the same mushaf, because you actually end up memorizing much stronger. And it's because like one of the ways you memorize is actually visually. So even if you kind of forget something, you memorize like where it was on the page, right? If it was on the left side of the page, the top of the page, the middle of the page, the end of the page. So when you use the same exact mushaf every time, your memory will usually be much stronger. It's actually like a visual picture of what you're memorizing. Another thing I started doing now, especially if you're busy, is to warm up the memorization, which basically means just set the page you're trying to memorize that day or whatever, maybe even that week, and just play it on repeat while you're even busy throughout the day, right? So if you're just driving, if you're walking, if you're at work, if you're at school, just having that page repeating in your ear. So what happens is that you warmed up already to that memory. You know how to pronounce the words. You might even have memorized a few words. And when you go home or whenever you have time and you start memorizing for real, when you start looking at the pages, you usually pick it up much quicker because you did that warm up in the beginning. And this last habit is really good for retaining or strengthening your memory specifically. And it's this small little habit tweak that I started doing. For me, it was like before I go to sleep, I would just use my phone. I would just like text people. I would watch videos or something like that. Basically, everyone I know does this, right? I started just changing that to I would just review, either reread or like recite from memory in my head the things that I've previously memorized a month ago, weeks ago, days ago, whatever. And just that alone, if you make that a habit before you go to sleep, that will really strengthen your memorization, specifically in the things that you've memorized like long time ago. Everyone will tell you, you have to revise what you've memorized or else it'll just end up forgetting, right? And this is obvious, but for a lot of people, it seems kind of like a drag. It seems like, oh man, I don't want to do that. But I found for me, just changing that habit is something I can do really consistently, and then I think it's pretty beneficial. Then if there's any tips you have, let me know, because I'm not gonna lie, I need them just as bad as you probably do, bro. So, assalamu alaikum.